Okay, so today we're going to talk about a one-step equation and how to solve them. If just by thinking about the term one-step equation, you know there's probably going to be one step in order to solve. Now, before we get into what that one step is, let's talk about the basics of an expression. Pause the video and write down the coefficient, variable, and add into their definitions. These are very important. A coefficient is a number that is being multiplied by the variable. A variable is a symbol that represents a value, and an addend is the number being added to another, also known as a constant. So we have an example of a coefficient, a variable, and an addend in this expression right here. 2 is being multiplied by the variable, which means it is your coefficient. X is a symbol that represents a value, so it is your variable. And 3, positive 3, is your addend, because it's being added. You will be asked to identify a coefficient, a variable, and an addend frequently throughout your math career, at least in middle school. So make sure that you know this. Okay, next, we're just working with one-step equations when you have addition today, so write this down. When you have an addend, you'll be working with addition. And the one step is to add the opposite of the addend to both sides of the equation. Write that down. When you have an addend, you add the opposite of the addend to both sides of the equation. And we do this because we're using both the inverse and equality properties. So the inverse property of addition means the sum of a number and its opposite is 0. So basically you want the addend to equal 0. And you use the equality property because what you did to one side of the equation you have to do to the other. Pause the video, make sure you write this down. Okay, next we have an example. X plus 3 equals 9. Before we begin this, I want to talk about something. Okay, so X is by itself, right? But there actually is a coefficient. There's a coefficient in front of X, and that coefficient is 1. It's a phantom. You can't see it, but it's there. Suppose X were an apple. If X was an apple, you could say, hey, Miss Homer, I have an apple. That's the same as saying, I have one apple. So here we have an X. Well, that's the same as having one X. So please note that if the variable stands alone, there really is a phantom 1 right in front. Now, do we need that in this case? Maybe not, but note that that is important. Okay, so we have X plus 3 equals 9. Now, in your head, you're probably saying, oh, Miss Homer, I know that X has to be 6 because 6 plus 3 is 9. I am happy that you know how to do that, but I am more interested in the steps than I am in you knowing that X is equal to 6. Okay, so on your tests and quizzes, you'll be graded based on your steps rather than your answer. Okay, so let's see. First, let's identify the addend. So since we're working with addition, we have an addend of 3. We're going to need to use that one step of adding the opposite of the addend to both sides of the equation. Okay, so let's think of an equation as a balancing beam. Okay, so the left side has to equal the right side. I'm going to draw a line down the equal sign. You may want to do this for a little while until you get used to it. So the left side of the equation, X plus 3, is equal to the right side of the equation, 9. Now 3 is the addend, so we're going to do that one step. We're going to use the inverse property of addition to solve this equation. So the opposite of 3 is negative 3. So we're going to add negative 3 over here. And we're left with X plus, well, 3 and negative 3 is 0, equals, okay, well, what I did to one side of the equation, I must do to the other. Add negative 3 to this side. We end up with 6. Any number plus 0 is equal to that number. X plus 0 is X. So X has to equal 6. Notice that I lined up my equal sign down this line. Okay, now I want to go back in and identify the properties that were used. This right here that says a number added to its opposite is 0 is called your inverse property of addition. This right here, where we added negative 3 to both sides of the equation. Eventually, I will be able to circle this. Okay, come on, smart board. There we go. We added negative 3 to both sides of the equation. This is called your equality property. And I threw one more at you. Any number added to 0 is equal to that original number. This is called your identity property. Identity property of addition. So make sure to write that down. All right, we're going to do a couple of examples, so bear with me. Make sure you write everyone down. Okay, this next one, pause the video and think to yourself, what is the addend in this case? Okay, negative 10 is the addend. It's on the same side as the variable. It's being added to the variable. Negative 10 is your addend. I'm going to draw my line right here. Okay, so my first step is to add the opposite of the addend to both sides. Well, the opposite of negative 10 is 10. Again, the goal is to make this addend equal to 0. So now what I added 10 to both sides. So we're left with negative 2 is equal to m, right? M plus 0. Now, in this case, I'm going to stop doing the m plus 0, but I thought it was important to show you in the first example that that's really what you're doing. I'm just going to drop the plus 0 because I don't really need it. But here we have negative 2 is equal to m. Now, as we did with the last problem, let's talk about the properties that were used. The fact that negative 10 plus 10 is equal to 0, that is your inverse property. And when we added 10 to both sides of the equation, this is your equality property. Okay? And what's cool about this is that you can always check your work. So if m is equal to negative 2, then negative 12 should equal negative 10 plus negative 2. And so we just replace negative 2 with m. And it's true, right? Negative 10 plus negative 2 is equal to negative 12. So we know we're right because we substituted the values back in. Okay, this one's super, super tricky. You need to make sure you have this one in your notes. 10 is equal to 15 minus p. Well, we don't subtract in our math class, right? We add the opposite. So 10 is really equal to 15 and the opposite of p. Whatever p is, it's its opposite. Okay, so now let's look at this addend here. So we have 15 as our addend. I'm going to go ahead and draw that line. 15 is our addend. I'm going to add the opposite of the addend so that it equals 0 to both sides of the equation. So we're left with negative 5 is equal to the opposite of p. But we're not done. In order to have solved for the variable correctly, p must be by itself. There can't be a number in front of p. Remember earlier I talked about there being a phantom 1 in front of a variable that stands alone? Well, if there's a negative sign in front of the variable, that means there's a phantom negative 1 right there. So therefore it's not alone because we have a negative 1 accompanying that p. Okay, so here, let's think of it on a number line. We're going to think of it in terms of multiplication later. But if negative 5 is equivalent to the opposite of p, then p should equal 5. And that's your final answer. So p should equal 5. Okay, now let's identify the inverse inequality properties. Okay, so 15 and negative 15 equals 0. That is your inverse. I'm just going to write I for inverse, okay? And then next, we add negative 15 to both sides of the equation, because what you do to one side of the equation, you must do to the other. This is your E, your equality property. All right, we're going to do one fraction problem. So you do the same thing when you have fractions. A fraction is just a number. Okay, so before I do this, I'm going to go ahead and convert these to improper because it's easier for me to work with improper fractions. So negative 1 and 1/2. 1 times 2 is 2 plus 1 is 3. So this is really negative 3 halves. Went ahead and rewrote it. Swapped it and everything. Okay, so our addend here is negative 3 halves. So let's add the opposite of this addend to both sides using the inverse property of addition. So let's add 3 halves to both sides of the equation. Let's draw this line. Okay, and off to the side I'm going to find a common denominator. So we have negative 5 fourths plus 6 fourths. So we end up with 1/4. when we add those together, we end up with m equals 1/4. And that's essentially it. We could always add it in there if we wanted to, just to see. Okay. Next, let's move on to some word problems. So we're still using the 5-step problem solving plan. Okay, the first step is to read the problem. Isabella is cooking muffins. The recipe calls for 7 cups of sugar. She's already put in 2 cups. How many more cups does she need to put in? So that's the first step. Second step, we need to define the variable. So we don't know how many cups she needs to put in. So why don't I say C equals number of cups. Okay, so it calls for 7 cups of sugar. She's already put in 2 cups. So we don't know what C is, the number of cups she needs to put in. Okay, now I want us to get away from this. I want us to get away from solving directly for the variable. Okay, this is elementary. You guys are in middle school, therefore you can move away from solving directly for the variable. Let's work on mixing the variable in the equation. So let's set up a 1-step equation. C plus 2 equals 7. Okay? We've set up this 1-step equation. We have an add-in. Let's add the opposite of the add-in to both sides of the equation. We end up with C is equal to 5. Okay? And now we're going to answer the question. So she needs 5 cups. And we're done. Okay, Math Late Shot problem of the day is going to be a word problem involving fractions. Okay, so in order to earn a Math Late Shot, you'll have to define the variable, set up an equation, and solve for the variable. And your equation cannot be, you can't have your equation equal your variable. Okay, you've got to set it up just like we did in the last problem. Okay, so here's the problem. A recipe for cookies calls for 3 1/4 cups of sugar. Amy has already put in 3 1/9 cups. How many more cups does she need in order to put in? And notice we have a little cookie man here. Okay, so use the 5-step problem solving plan to solve for the variable. Good luck. Thank you for watching.